Welcome to Cultivating Resilience, a podcast from Cultivemos, the Network for Farmer Well-Being. I'm Hans Hageman.
And I'm K. Megan Washington. Cultivating Resilience is all about the intersection of farming and mental health. We cover everything from financial planning to community building, all with an eye towards practical advice.
We explore personal strategies for stress management and the systemic issues underlying those stresses, because all of those things contribute to mental health.
For the podcast, we have wide-reaching conversations with some incredible farmers and farm advocates, but we can't always fit the whole interview into a podcast episode. So we've created videos of our discussions so we can share even more with you.
We hope you enjoy this interview and get something from it. And if you'd like to learn more about Cultivemos or listen to the podcast, we've put some links in the description below. Until next time, stay grounded. I'm here with Minkah Taharkah, and we're here to talk about the California Farmer Justice Collaborative, Sankofa Gardens, and Building Youth Tomorrow Today. So with that as a framework, Minkah, could you talk about your work with those three organizations, particularly in the context of you being an earth steward, a multiplicitous artist, and intuitive healer?
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you all for having me today. I'm very excited for the intention of this podcast and just talking about some of the work that I have been doing over the past few years. The work that I've been doing with Sankofa Gardens comes from my mentor and fellow designer, Brandy Mack, who is the founder of the Butterfly Movement. So the Sankofa Gardens started as a mutual aid effort to support communities in East Oakland learning how to grow their own food in their backyards. And it started during the height of COVID, people really taking a hard look at what was going on in terms of food shortages in their neighborhoods. People had interest in growing their own food. Some people were already doing it to a certain extent, but there was a really high interest at that time. And so I worked with her to support families in building gardens with other earth stewards in the East Bay for Black families in East Oakland, particularly because, as we look at some of the historical disparities for Black folks and Black and Brown communities across our nation, we tend to be hit with the most highest rates of food apartheid. And because of that, we're taking it back into our own hands and saying we have the knowledge in our communities to be able to support our members with access to remembrance of this knowledge that started with our ancestors. The term Sankofa even means to go back and fetch it. And so calling it Sankofa Gardens rather than the other historical contextual phrase of Victory Gardens, it was like we are going back to our roots to support our people at a time when we don't want to be just subjugated to, waiting for someone to come and help us when we know that we have the momentum to do it ourselves. And so we gather every month at Castlemont High School, which Brandy Meg is also an alum of, and she was instrumental in building out an acre farm that was built upon asphalt using biomimicry and permaculture strategies to turn this basketball court into a flourishing garden and farm that, we're growing bananas in East Oakland. Okay, we have grapevines and nopales, we have a flourishing food giveaway program that is housed out of there. And when we go once a month for these gatherings with our Sankofa families, it gives us an opportunity to learn with our farm managers. One of the main farm managers there, Arthur McDade, he's actually an alum himself. So it's this process of empowering our community through one of the other terms we use is Kujichagulia, which if you're familiar with the principles of Kwanzaa, it is the second day, which means self-determination. And so when we think about how we battle some of these systemic changes, a lot of it starts from within, starts with empowerment, and it's similar to the work that we've done with Building Youth Tomorrow Today as well, which is an organization founded by Roger Brown out of Fresno, and the impetus there is to support youth in Fresno, Black youth in Fresno, in West Fresno to be exact, in learning how to grow food, especially because Fresno is one of, like, the Central Valley is the breadbasket of not just California and the nation, but really the world in terms of exports. And so it doesn't make sense for our Black youth who are growing up in this legacy of like agricultural abundance to not have access to the tools and material resources to be able to learn that information themselves. Both of these programs are very much focused on supporting families, communities, and within that youth, and bringing about a pathway for succession planning, wherein we are connecting elder Black farmers with younger folks to be able to stimulate the information processing back and forth. Because a lot of the time, that's like what ends up happening is our farmers end up aging out of the industry, and they don't really have folks to pass on their land to or their information. And so we know, like with our programming knowledge, Brandy Mac also brought me into supporting that project to be able to essentially build out some of this programming in a way that's comprehensive, when we know that, sometimes we look towards government or look towards local agencies, and we recognize that a lot of our champions, our cultural champions, are right here, and can support us with that knowledge themselves. So going back to Zone Zero, as we say, as it pertains to my work with the California Farmer Justice Collaborative, I am really excited about my position in this organization. I started in June of 2022. It has been a journey of recognizing the important work that this group of 12 farmers came together along with allies from different other nonprofits and community organizations to really focus in on what are some of our farmers' needs, particularly our small farmer population. And so what we are focused on is creating an environment that fosters community, recognizing that that is a big piece of how farmers get their information is through having access to people that they trust to give them that information. So acting as a hub that connects the farmers who are doing the actual work with some of the folks who are involved in more policy-based organizations or governmental organizations that can share opportunities and resources for gaining financial resources or informational technical assistance support, which is hinged upon one of our major successes, which was the passing of the Farm Equity Act. The Farm Equity Act of 2017 passed through a phenomenal effort of our farmers as well as our collaborators that came together to be able to solidify the term socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher in agricultural code. And this was really important because never before was there an acknowledgement of the legacy of historical racism and oppression on farmers of color written into statute. And so being able to have that as a foundation is really critical to be able to have a jumping off point for when other legislation is then being brought into formation, or when it's being thought of. It's like we have to start with that. And many of us have known that, we've been knowing that. But as it goes, a lot of times our legislation and our policy entities, it has taken time to be able to enforce that framework being brought to the forefront. So with the passing of that bill, it really forced, the California Farming Department of Agriculture, as well as the USDA, to not be able to turn a blind eye to some of the foundational systems of oppression that are actively affecting our farmers, and specifically our BIPOC farmers across the state.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work that you're talking about, and this whole menu really resonates with me, just based on work that I've done with a group that you may be familiar with, Farm School NYC, then the Black Farmer Fund out here, and now having come down to the Mississippi Delta for 3 months now, and looking at these huge fields, but then also understanding that most of them are owned by white farmers and they're monocrops with cotton, soybean, and corn. What's the role for the individual farmer? And so you have a 10,000-foot view, but you also have a ground level view. And you said something about a lot of the work starts within. And, knowing that you're an intuitive healer and an artist as well, I'm guessing it's certain things, but can you speak more to what that means in terms of the work starts within?
First of all, I think that we're all artists, that we all have some sort of creative genius within us in the way that we operate in the world. And for me, mine takes on many forms. So I write poetry, I make visual art, I do digital design, photography. I'm also an actor, performer, and dancer, and yoga instructor, creative director. And so my framework is very holistic. And so I utilize that as like my own foundation for how I operate in the world. And so when I say that it starts within, we bring up the conversation of positionality, of what it means to recognize ourselves and what role we play in the world, and how that affects how we are seen and what opportunities we have, not taking it to an us versus them framework, but really being able to see ourselves within the collective. And this is really crucial, because I've been an organizer for the past, I will say since I was in my mom's belly, and growing up in a household that really reinforced justice and consciousness in the form of how I interact in the world as a Black woman, as an Afro-Latina woman. Like my mother's family is from Costa Rica by way of Jamaica. And so being like part of this lineage of the diaspora, my name, Minkah, means justice. And so I always say that it gives me recognition in the way that I move about the world, in my purpose. And so when we think of these like external or like larger like terms, and we talk about like white supremacy and imperialism and colonialism, and those terms are there, and then we see how they show up in our everyday lives, and then we see how they show up in our bodies. If we look at some of the work that Joy DeGruy writes about in post-traumatic slave syndrome, if we look at Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands, and so many more people who study the like embodied experience of racism that is institutional, and we understand that I believe it takes an inside out approach, because if we only focus on the outside, then we will miss the way that a lot of these institutionalized forms of oppression manifest in physical illness and in mental health issues, in emotional issues. A lot of our farmers, there's this question, and I've heard this question asked a lot, like, how does it affect your mental health? How does it affect your physical, emotional, spiritual health? And so I utilize my my artistic background as a way to inform how we can deal with some of these logistical and political issues in a way that is more balanced. Like as a yoga instructor, I know that for me, when I'm stressed, I utilize movement and I utilize some of my other crafts as a way to release. I appreciate the framework that yoga brings, because it focuses on breath, it focuses on energy, it focuses on seeing our stimuli as energy. So then it's like you can take that conversation that you had with a loan officer where they told you that you're not qualified. And you can look at it for its logistical implications. And you can also understand how it affects your ability to provide for your family, your ability to feel like you're even capable of farming for subsistence for yourself and creating a business, creating like supporting your well-being. And a lot of the issues that we find that are most impactful have to deal with meeting our basic needs. And so when your basic needs are not met, those are foundational ways that you show up in the world, that you show up with other people, that you're even able to be a functional human being. And when there are institutional components that don't allow you to easily access your basic needs, that just further reinforces the importance of why people need to have opportunities to recognize that they have control, first of all, in mitigating the responses to some of the things that we deal with that are extremely unfair, that have been going on for generations. At the same time, not as daunting. And I think that sometimes it may seem like, when we look at the phrases institutional racism and patriarchy and violence, like, we have to boil it down to what can we do every day, and how can we support each other in community? How can we reach out for resources? Who has the resources? Where are they? And creating opportunities for farmers to have more resources in terms of like mental health resources, as well as technical assistance resources. We need to make sure that that those opportunities are more equitably offered for our folks who are dealing with, climate change heavily affecting. I mean, here in California, I'm sure you all have heard about the torrential rains and storms that we've been dealing with, and how that has been affecting the crop season. Like, for our work with Building Youth Tomorrow Today, like, we loosely put together a plan for how the youth can engage with the farmer on like a weekly basis. And we know that has to shift because Fresno and our Central Valley is on a former lake bed. So how does the flooding from the largest snowpack in the Sierra foothills, how is that going to affect Fresno and Central Valley as a whole in the next coming months, as well as now? So there's levels to it, I will say.
Yeah, Minka, with regard to those levels, you talk about institutional impediments. You talk about the challenge of climate change. With things like that, I know one of the themes that's important for you is the development of resilience. So could you explain what resilience means to you? How do you develop it in your own life? And how do the individuals that you're working with craft their own resilience in the face of all these challenges?
I definitely appreciate this question, because I think that resilience is a very interesting term. I find that oftentimes for BIPOC folks, resilience is used as a term to like speak on how great BIPOC communities are at experiencing adversity and bouncing back. And I want to bring in a reframing that doesn't really focus on the term resilience, but more focuses on our empowerment. Because I think that when I look at the way that our communities are able to empower each other, it focuses on the both and. So we look at the adversity that we're experiencing, and we also we understand its impacts. And we also are saying that something needs to change, which is part of the impetus that led to folks coming together to pass the Farm Equity Act, for example. That was largely built on involving ourselves in policy and more legislative processes. And at the same time, we recognize that being resilient is not the only answer, that some of these things need to change. We can't just be lauded for our ability to bounce back from harmful processes. So a lot of that comes down to how do we organize internally and build community power? How do we take out some of the middle entities that like dilute power from the community members themselves and re-gift, remember, re re-engage our farmers in a way that shows them and uplifts their expertise as people who are living the experience as farmers now, while also giving them the opportunity and the option to learn what it looks like to engage in more policy or political action, and creates an inside-outside perspective where we, especially like as California Farmer Justice Collaborative, we know the legacy of like BIPOC people gathering together to challenge the status quo. We know the effects that that has on our nation, especially like building building that that people to people power and organizing in that way, taking a grassroots approach is really key, because none of what we do is guaranteed. So it's a consistently emergent process in what the best strategy is. And so I will say that CFJC is definitely on an emergent process. We are still experiencing the major impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on how that's affected farmers even being able to receive funding. And there have been a number of relief programs, but beyond that, it's like, how do you handle that on top of drought and wildfires and flooding? And how do we ensure that even when our governmental agencies are not able to respond as quickly and as broadly as we would like, how do we also reinforce our internal social capital that we have built within ourselves as an organization and our collaborators who also care about small farmers being able to benefit from a lot of these governmental programs. And so for me, like when I think again of of resilience, embodying the change that we'd like to see is part of what I do, from what I've been learning within myself. And I think that a lot of our members and CFJC as a whole would agree with doing the things that we want to see occur on a larger scale, and be like modeling that for our other organizations and our other farmers, and even for our governmental agencies as well.
In terms of the both and in terms of the collaborations that you refer to, I imagine, as somebody who was raised in Harlem, New York, and again is now in the Mississippi Delta, which and the government doesn't use the term food apartheid, but they do designate the Mississippi Delta where I am as a food desert. But I also know those two distinctions, Harlem, New York, and now here in the Delta, that there's an urban-rural divide that crosses racial boundaries. And I imagine in California, as you try to whether it was with the Justice Act or any of the initiatives that you're involved in, there's still that challenge of bringing together both urban and rural. Can you talk about those challenges and how you've overcome them?
Yes, actually, this is an issue, a topic that's really exciting to me, because I'm from Los Angeles. I grew up in South Central in Leimert Park, and now I'm living in the Sierra Foothills, and I moved here intentionally because I knew that in order for me to be able to, I'm largely like plant-based, alkaline diet, and so I want to know where my food comes from. And I've had the opportunity to travel to different parts of the world to be able to see how they grow their food in comparison to how we grow ours. And so that idea of what you're saying, how there's like an urban to rural divide, and there's a very like a geographical divide, and then an ideological divide, a systemic divide. And the bottom line is we need to bridge those gaps. So a big piece of what CFJC is extremely interested in is creating urban to rural networks. And so actually part of our strategy for this year is to be able to have specific events in different counties across the state to be able to focus on building community, and building our networks in these different in the different counties that we're in across the state, to be able to start having those conversations more intentionally so that people are not getting as siloed. Because when you look at some of the ways that we even look at resource opportunities, they'll be like, well, this opportunity is for urban growers and here's this opportunity for rural growers. Where's the insurance that there's some kind of like flow happening? And CFJC is a perfect nexus to be able to stimulate that in a tangible way. And so part of the work that I'm doing with Brandy Mack, she is phenomenal, first of all. And her work within permaculture and biomimicry design, and recognizing that we have to work at the edges where we're not seeing as much. And a lot of times this divide doesn't really get brought up as highest priority. And so within the work that we are doing with Building Youth Tomorrow Today, and also branching out to other organizations within Fresno, like the African American Farmers of California and other youth groups, we are taking them on site visits to be able to get cross exposure for youth from the valley and youth in the city, youth in the urban spaces. So, for example, I've coordinated youth, these site visit projects before, where we took youth from Fresno and we brought them to Castlemont Farm, so they are able to see, like, we turned this asphalt into a farm and we are utilizing it in these ways. This is where we have our produce washing station, and here is our walk-in refrigerator unit, and like, this is how we sign up and have folks coming in volunteering, and then taking youth from the city to the rural, where there's more land, there's oftentimes more equipment that they're not used to seeing. And so I think that this is a conversation that needs to be more prioritized in many of our organizations. And I think that in the work that I'm doing with the several spaces I'm involved in, this is a priority for us, especially because we're looking at it first with the people. It starts with people first: people, place, and program. How do we begin having the conversations? And so when I bring myself, when I come as a Black woman to a rural environment where there's not as many of me present, I don't really have to do anything, and nobody else has to do anything either. I'm just being there, and they're being there. And that in itself is an inherent and extremely critical part of what that shift looks like. And so continuing to do this, it's also not something that is like tenets of like white supremacy, and how it shows up in our tangible spaces is urgency. We're not rushing. We don't have to rush. When we, look at the biomimicry and permaculture principles, much of that is in observation. Much of that time is spent seeing how things are already doing what they're doing. And our current agricultural system and our political system, the current framework for how this country and much of the world is operating, is in a quick manner that doesn't really allow us to take time to reflect, pause, see, and then act, which oftentimes when you do those steps prior, your action will be more relevant, more fulfilling, and we won't have to then double back and, mitigate issues when we could plan for them in the beginning.
So a few things come to mind with some of this. You earlier mentioned Black farmers aging out. You've got the building youth aspect of it with the young people that you're taking out and showing how things are currently done. You talk about biomimicry and nature. With all those things, how do you use both ancestral wisdom as well as intergenerational work to create bridges amongst all those different pieces?
I appreciate this question because I think it goes back to the being aspect. Part of this work takes a big amount of faith, in the sense that you can only prescribe and plan so much. A lot of it just depends. You just have to see, and you have to take time, and you have to wait. I will say that it's a beautiful metamorphosis process that happens in the little ways. Like within the youth group in Fresno, a lot of the folks come from families that have been in Fresno for generations. And so the sheer fact that they are still there and still connected to each other, and also working to practice more regenerative processes in their own communities, that in itself is a result of what it looks like to activate intergenerational and ancestral wisdom. One of our farmers who has been farming, he's like a fourth generation farmer. So he is a representation of ancestral wisdom. And so him interacting with the youth who have also come from families that have been there, like we're seeing it in real time. And so I think a big part of this too, which, CFJC is also working on building out a documentary to be able to kind of catalog and document some of these stories, because storytelling is a big part of like my heritage and our heritage of the African diaspora, and within many other cultures. And so recognizing that we've been doing the work that we say we've been wanting to see. And sometimes, like, maybe it's not like written down in somebody's report, but we are living it. And so being able to like feel comfortable and grounded in the knowledge and the lived experience, I'm gonna like use that as a response to the resilience piece as well, because I think that sometimes there becomes a an expectation to prove that you're doing what you're doing. And that's also a tenet of how institutionalized racism is utilized against BIPOC people. And it's like, no, we don't have to prove anything, because we know what it is that we're doing, and we're going to keep on doing it. And these documentaries, these opportunities to do podcasts like this, these connections to other folks who are working on the same things as us, is just reminders that, first of all, we are worthy and we're enough, of like starting there as a foundation. That's also a piece of that ancestral wisdom, recognizing that the work that we are doing here and now is informed by the struggles and the joys that our ancestors experienced. So saying that phrase, like, I am my ancestors' greatest dreams, we're living that now. Like the fact that I can be here speaking with you, coming from where I come from, where you come from, it's happening. It's happening.
With regard to young people as part of this intergenerational piece, what are your thoughts on whether it's developing a pipeline, bringing systems or change into the school systems, awareness to youth, not only for your personal healing, but frankly for our societal survival? There needs to be more connection to the land, to food, that kind of thing. What changes do you see, or are you taking part in, or that need to happen but haven't yet?
Like you said, for the sake of our society, our connection to the land needs to be reinforced. And I think that there is momentum in that direction, and there are people who are doing this work. We have the National Young Farmers Coalition that focuses on farmers under 35, honing in on the fact that, yes, it is a both and. Like, we need more focus within the schools, and also education system, like that has its own issues, I'll say, or its own barriers to being able to kind of like knit them in together in a more cohesive way. But again, I want to mention Brandy Mack and some initiatives that she's working on through an initiative, within like farm to fork equity programming, to be able to support teachers directly in showing them what it means to connect to the land in all subjects. Because when we think about like how we got here, a lot of it has been like systemic dispossession and disconnection from the land. So a lot of kids, may not have even had grass or a lawn, or the only like dirt that they see is in little like squares around trees on the sidewalk. That's why it's layered. There's like so many levels of like, you have to slowly integrate these things so that they become normalized. So even like starting with youth learning how to grow a seed, having nursery mats where they can start germinate seeds inside of classrooms, having hydroponic systems inside of classrooms that are a topic of discussion and a topic of production for the students to witness. It starts with integrating all of these things into their everyday lives, because we know that the process of disconnecting us from these things was like, there were aspects of it that were very extreme, and there were aspects that have also been slow and gradual. So there's a combination of, within the reintegration, there needs to be some extreme things, and there needs to be some slow and steady pieces. So I would say like, having more like farm schools, having more like being in that like ties in the ancestral wisdom pieces as well. But I think that I personally am looking forward to doing more research on what people are doing now and what we can continue to build upon, because I think that with the onset of the pandemic, and even before then, but particularly within the past 3 years, folks have been wanting to recognizing some of the limitations of the systems that they relied on before to support them. And so I see more opportunities like this conversation and like this podcast being able to be a resource that people can then go and listen to and spark more dialogue, because it starts as a thought first. It starts as a nugget first, and then builds into people building their collective capacity to then being able to assess like what is possible for us to be able to support our youth, and having more pipelines. So when we have programs like the one, like that one we mentioned in Fresno, Building Youth Tomorrow Today, there's more that are budding as we speak. And that is going to take time. And as it takes time, we're going to see more youth growing up, getting more accustomed to going back to the land. Which I think is the ultimate point of this.
We talked about youth. What role can and should eaters, wherever they are, play in advocacy, politics, or changing things?
I appreciate that, because there's that saying of like, well, if you eat, then you should care about growing things. And we obviously know why that is not accessible for everyone, because many people today are able to get all their food without ever stepping on any soil anywhere or knowing what the process of growing anything is. And so doing the personal work to like, is there a local community garden around you? Like doing research in that sense too, to see like what initiatives are already happening in your area, because that oftentimes there's people who are doing exactly what it is that we're looking for. We just have to find them and also be on the lookout for them. And so I would say that starting there first, to know what role you can play, because of course not everybody is a farmer and not everybody needs to be a farmer. How can we utilize each of our roles to be able to support the people who are growing the food that then gets turned into those packaged items that are on your shelf at your local grocery store. I think that there's a momentum for more localized production, because that is a larger way that small farmers in particular are more supported, rather than focusing on big ag. And a lot of bigger agricultural entities end up also being part of the issue for our smaller farmers. And so as we see, these rifts between folks within the Central Valley, like you have our larger, like Wonderful, we have Blue Diamond owning, like buying up swaths of land. And so, of course, not everybody can be farmers because there's a lot of land that has been bought up by larger financial institutions to, cushion their portfolios. And so that's why I think that, like, learning about who's in your area, what work they're doing, and what role you can take. Also, if there's some dirt in somewhere close by, that you can get your hands in the soil. Oftentimes, like, just putting your hands in the soil is a therapeutic process in itself. I'm a firm believer that this is a deeply, like, embodied in spiritual practice. We're birthed and we go back to the soil. Like, if we look at the processes of composting and turning things that are rotting back into something that can give life to other plants, it's like the earth already has all the codes. And so being able to start small and recognizing, like, hey, actually, I don't know how to grow anything. I don't know what that looks like. I don't really like getting dirty that much, but I do eat. And because I eat, like, do you have children in your life? Do you have children yourself? Like, how do we want our society to keep on going? And I recognize that this is like, this goes into, like, how people see themselves in the world, like how people see themselves in relationship to their fellow human. And that's why this is so important, because it brings us into conversation about everything, like how we eat, how we connect, how we form relationships. Like, even when I was talking about my breakfast, eating this avocado, and Andrew was like, well, yeah, you're from California. I'm like, yeah, I'm from California. The avocados, we love our avocados here. But then also seeing, we look in the news and see how avocados are going to they've been rising in prices because of, issues in our imports, in the details of what it looks like to get food from other places. And so it's like, we look at these things on a larger framework, and then we have to stop and say, like, how much time and energy can we give to all the different moving pieces? And then also not cause ourselves stress and anxiety in the process. Because a lot of times that stress and anxiety of, like, what can I do, ends up pushing people away from even delving deeper into the conversation. So it's like, slow down. It's okay. Not you by yourself can fix all these issues. Not you by yourself can stop the dairy producers from, the way that they are treating their animals. Like, we have to branch out and connect with each other. So connecting over Zoom and virtually is cool. Following different social media accounts. And also, that's why I said, like, go outside. Who's in your neighborhood? Like, because I guarantee starting there, you'll be able to find something. And, I think that there's a lot of initiatives trying to bring more community support systems in communities that have historically been disenfranchised as well. Because, for me growing up, there wasn't a close by community garden. And the one that did used to exist got shut down. And so even if I was looking it up, it's not there anymore. And so I decided, I was like, well, I need to be part of the change, because that's the way we're going to get it done. And that's something that people like me, Black women in particular, have been doing since the dawn of time. We look at our legacy folks like Fannie Lou Hamer, we look at Harriet Tubman, we look at like how we utilize our struggle for liberation and freedom as a tool for community building and empowerment. Those are the tenets that I just keep coming back to because I feel like those are the foundations.
I like that. Just as an aside, I actually live in the county where Fannie Lou Hamer's family moved, and there's that history in front of me all the time now. And so, Minkah, with all the moving pieces that you talk about, you're juggling a lot of them. Where do you find the most joy in the work that you do?
Honestly, I find the most joy working with the families, particularly because I'm from a neighborhood that, was struggling with lots of police presence, you know, quote unquote underperforming schools, increased police presence on those schools, a lot of disenfranchisement that I saw it happening in my community, and I was like, well, is this just how it is? Is this just how we are? And then recognizing that, oh, access to resources plays a huge role in that. Maybe if there were less accessible liquor stores on corners and more grocery stores and places that sold fresh and organic produce, maybe that would play a role in how our youth are performing in class. If you grow up having more access to hot Cheetos and Coke for breakfast, that nutritional deficiency is gonna totally inform the way you're able to show up in school. And so a lot of my organizing started with school ticketing and supporting the initiatives to get rid of over policing of students in schools and the reinforcement of the school to prison pipeline, and recognizing how food played a big role in well, maybe a lot of kids are not getting into class on time because they have to go somewhere else to get food before class, or they don't even eat before class so they're tired. And so when I think about those pieces that informed a lot of the beginning of my my career and what I'm doing now, and I'm able to one-on-one work is where I thrive personally. I enjoy being a connector of people, of bringing together folks who have a common need, a common interest, and it was just funny because in one of our Sankofa Garden days, someone was asking the people why they came to the day, and they're like, "Oh, because Minkah told me about it." And so I'm like, "Okay, cool. I'm glad that I can be a source of access and inspiration as I'm also learning to seek that out myself, because I just know that there's these little wins, they build up. When I see a seed growing and sprouting and I watch it every day, I feel that process happening in myself, and how I'm even able to be here in this role as the coordinator for the California Farmer Justice Collaborative program, coordinating within Sankofa Gardens and with Building Youth Tomorrow Today. And so no movement, no momentum, no movement is too small to make a real change.
Well, Minkah, finally, is there anything I should have asked that I didn't, something you'd like to talk about that we didn't get to?
No, nothing that we didn't get to. I would just reinforce the piece on taking care of yourself, and people taking the time to focus on their mental and emotional and physical health before trying to tackle an issue, because our well-being is really critical to sustaining any of these movements, and our movements are only as well as we are. One of my strategic facilitator comrades, Ash Love, always says that, and I cannot tell you the amount of times I've had to return to that phrase, because so many of us try to like go to the problem outside of us first. And it's like, but did you eat today? Did you drink some water? How are you? Like, how are you? Like, maybe you showed up all crunchy and agitated in that meeting because you needed to like get some more sleep the night before. Um, and I think that like that is something that I want to highlight more in our when we get our work hats on and our professional hats on. It's like be mindful and like take care of yourself, because you taking care of you is going to allow you to show up for others in a more authentic way. And I strive to have more authentic and integral relationships, and I think that that is also a way of, you know, bringing in more justice in our communities too.
That is a great place to end it. Thank you very much, Minkah.
Thank you, Hans.